Thank you so much for joining us today on Yom HaShoah. I couldn't think of a better person to talk about Holocaust education in Britain than you, Scott, because you have taken so many people through March of the Living and changed their lives. So I would love to start by talking about your life. We grew up very similar age, similar school, similar place. We both ended up pretty much also in similar places in many ways, serving our community. What was your journey to March of the Living? How did you get interested in Holocaust education?
Well, first of all, thank you, Laura. It's great to be here. It's in this difficult time, in this unprecedented time. It's good to see you, even if it's on this sort of, again, bizarre way, but I'm truly honored to be here, so thank you. I went to a school in Northwest London, not too dissimilar to you, as you've mentioned, and I didn't really grow up with any Holocaust education, which is unlike you. I grew up in a very sort of traditional Jewish background, but not particularly observant. And I was involved in the financial services industry. I joined a broking firm straight out of school, and was very fortunate enough to have then been sent to New York and worked in London. And in 1993, I found myself in Tokyo and was invited with my wife to commemorate the life of a Japanese diplomat at the JCC in Tokyo. There was a very transient Jewish community, and it really was something that, when you live miles and miles away from home in a place which is considered the wilderness, certainly from a Jewish perspective, you do tend to migrate towards other Jews, and that's exactly what happened. And in 1993, I was invited with my wife, as I said, to this commemoration of a Japanese diplomat by the name of Chiene Sugihara. Sugihara was a remarkable individual. He had a fascinating life, which I could spend hours talking about, and I won't, because obviously we would literally bore everybody else, and that just wouldn't be fair. But the reality is that he saved Jews in the war, and he had been sent by the Japanese government in 1939, early 1940, to Kaunas, Lithuania, and as the vice consulate.
Where my family's from.
That's right, you're from Lithuania. I knew that, actually.
Kaunas.
And he was approached to issue transit visas to go through Japan, initially by two Dutch yeshiva boys, but by the time he had requested to have these transit visas issued on 3 separate occasions. By the third time, there were now hundreds of refugees looking to escape out of Poland and out of Lithuania. And his wife, he had already passed away at this stage. His wife explained to the audience, which we sat in Japanese, through a translator, that for humanitarian reasons, Sugihara, his wife, and their personal assistant, their aide, decided that they would issue these visas. And what we know for sure is that approximately 3,500 Jews were saved. Heard numbers as high as 6,500. We certainly know that 3,500 Jews were saved. Now, what was remarkable about this is he only had a very narrow window to issue these visas. And during that period, they, if I'm right in saying, they had to issue them all by hand, because Japanese writing is up and down. It's not the way we write or the way. And so everything was not stamped. It had to be written by hand. And he issued these visas, the 3 of them, against the wishes of the Japanese government. He ultimately lost his job after the war, and he spoke fluent Russian. He went and lived for a little while in Russia, and he then ended up going back to Japan, and in the 1970s, he was actually recognized as a hero as opposed to a villain by the Japanese government. Having done something which for the Japanese was very, very unusual. He went behind authorities' back. This story And, as I said, I could tell you much more about this story. For the Jews, they ended up in Japan, then they ended up in Shanghai, in a ghetto in Shanghai, which I'm sure many people are much more familiar with the story of the Shanghai ghetto. But this story for me was an eye-opener. Beyond an eye-opener, I sat in Tokyo listening to the story of a Japanese diplomat that had saved Jews. I grew up, my father would tell me stories about how his cousin had been a British soldier and had died on the Burma Railway. And so my impression of the Japanese was a very different impression. And this completely gave me a new set of eyes, if you like. The story became a little bit more personal in the fact that we used to go to shul every Shabbat in Tokyo. And it was a wonderful place. It was very mixed community, as you can imagine, in a small community. Everybody got on. And I sat next to this elderly gentleman, and my entire conversation with him was, "Good morning, Joseph. Shabbat Shalom. How are you?" And that was my conversation with this man. And he would smile and he would say Shabbat Shalom. And I remember very clearly, about a year later, he passed away. And nobody really knew him. It was very sad. The rabbi was very new to the community, and even some of the older people within the community, when I say older, they may have been young people, but they'd been there for a longer period of time. They knew him as the old guy, or Joseph who sat there, or Joseph who would take a bread roll from the little luncheon that would happen after Shabbat services and then go home. Nobody really knew him. It turns out that his name was Joseph Shimkin, and he had not only survived in Kaunas and been a recipient of one of Sugihara's visas, but also that he had learned how to forge the visas, because, as I said, Sugihara only had a very narrow window of which to issue them. And he had learned how to issue these visas or forge them. And he also knew how to place Jews looking to escape into the right hands and help them. Because, as you can imagine, and we see it time and time again in history, and we certainly have seen it many times when we studied the Holocaust. Many people didn't necessarily believe what was actually happening around them, even though there were warning signs. Even they couldn't believe it. And similarly, people may well have turned around and said, "Well, I have a visa, but I'm not going to. What am I going to do? I'm going to go to Japan. How am I going to get there? I've got no money." And there were many reasons. I got an old mother, or I got little kids. It's not going to happen, or it'll be all right tomorrow. Of course, we understand that was not the case. It's easy to say in hindsight. But they made, he helped them get out. And he himself supposedly lost a wife and a son in Kaunas, and got out literally on the last opportunity that he could. At the end of the war, he decided that he never wanted to go back to Europe, and he created a business and a life for himself. He married a Japanese lady. We didn't know this until after he passed away, because it was actually his wife who told the story.
Oh, gosh.
To the rabbi who had to bury him.
Mm-hmm.
And I only find the story out after he passed away. And yet I sat next to him most weeks. And it made such a profound impact on me that I wanted to learn more. I wanted to understand more. Understand is an interesting concept, because when you learn about the Holocaust, you realize, as you know, Laura, I mean, it's, the more you learn, the less you know. And certainly the less you understand, I think.
That's right. I think you know more, but understanding, comprehending, something else.
Correct. Absolutely correct. And so for me, this inspired me to want to learn more. And so I suppose my journey of getting involved in Holocaust education really started there. And it was my own journey. It was my own desire to learn. And the more I learned, the more I decided that other people needed to know. And clearly some people did and some people didn't. And in 1995, I moved to Hong Kong. And I was in Hong Kong for 15 years.
Wow.
And while there, I started to be involved in the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
And we brought over survivors from Australia, which was the nearest point.
Right. And there are a lot of survivors. I mean,
Australia, by the way,
survivor community.
It's a survivor community, exactly. I believe that it has the largest survivor community per capita outside of Israel.
That's right. Yeah, Australia.
And we were very lucky to have brought some wonderful people to speak. And the more I listened, the more I wanted to share, and the more I wanted to have my own children learn some of those stories. They were still quite small at the time. And that's really how it started. And then I guess 2006, one of the board members of the JCC, I was on the board, and she said to me, oh, I think we should go to Poland. I think we should take a group from Hong Kong to Poland. And I said, well, I think that's a fantastic idea. And
Mm-hmm.
as a student, she was Canadian. As a student, I went on this journey called March of the Living.
She said
to me,
right.
I said, well, I think that's very interesting. We should find out more about it. And I genuinely had no idea what it was. Of course, it had been going since 1988, but not in the UK. And that was really the first time I went. And just to sort of finish on that question, how did I get involved? We went with a survivor from Israel, actually originally from Strasbourg, who was a remarkable individual. And as you know yourself, when you are in Poland with a survivor telling you this is where I was,
yeah,
a very different experience to anything you can experience within Holocaust education.
Yes, I remember when I was on the march 2 years ago, the survivor who accompanied us on our bus stood in the barracks in Birkenau and said, this is exactly where we washed our face. These bunks is where we had 3 layers of people. This is where people's fluids came down. And he told us what it was like for him at a 16-year-old there. There's nothing strong coming back to your comprehend and understanding thing.
Yeah, I know exactly who you're referring to as well.
Eric,
Eric, he's a wonderful individual. And for me, going with the individual who we went with was Noah Klieger, who unfortunately passed away last year, who had the most remarkable story. He was actually a boxer in Auschwitz. There were Olympic champions in Auschwitz, boxers, footballers, everything. And to be with him, I think if my story began with Sugihara,
I
think it was cemented with him in the fact that I really wanted other people, and young people in particular, to know these stories and to understand what can happen when hate is allowed to really grow.
Yes, when hate is allowed to really grow. And I suppose that's the Yom HaShoah message for the future, is never to allow hate to grow. When we say never again, that's what we mean, not just about Jews, but in general.
100%. I mean, we've coined a phrase this year. Unfortunately, obviously, we're not going, but March for Living International has coined a phrase this year based on never again, because we have seen so many times since the Holocaust how many other genocides have taken place. And we all know. We don't know the stories. We don't know some of the intricacies, but we have heard the names. We've heard Rwanda. We've heard Cambodia. We've heard Srebrenica. Hatred is hatred. And we have a responsibility to teach our own and to teach everybody that hatred is unacceptable. It doesn't matter whether it's anti-Semitism, it doesn't matter whether it's Islamophobia, it doesn't matter whether it's bullying, whether it's homophobia, it does not matter. Hatred is unacceptable. And so we've coined the phrase never means never.
Yeah, to anyone ever. It's interesting what you're saying about those values, because often people who have values like that, who lead organisations, and you're the chair and founder of March of the Living UK, inculcate those organizations or that experience with those values. And the March of the Living in different countries has different tones and different culture and different values. And for those people watching this who haven't been on March of the Living, I would say, please God, when we can do it next year, you should go. And one of the reasons is, first of all, I grew up in a very big sort of Holocaust awareness space. My dad talked about it non-stop, many ways. I'd been to Lithuania, where my family were murdered, those who didn't get out. And I had sort of known, but it wasn't until I was there that I understood and comprehended. And your values, Scott, the gentleness, the dedication, the thoroughness, and people getting on with each other, inculcate March of the Living, where you have people from all different types of Judaism in Britain, all different backgrounds, absolutely united. And you're very tough on the messages that do not get misused. So you will not let people say, because the Holocaust happened, you've got to be more religious, you've got to be more Zionist. And that is a beautiful and unusual thing. So I want to thank you for that work on behalf of Anglo Jewry. Thank you. I want to ask, when you running Jewish organizations in Britain, what can we say? It's a mixed blessing. What was it like trying to start March of the Living here?
Well, can we move rapidly on? I have to say that I had an advantage and a disadvantage. And that advantage was I didn't know anybody and I didn't understand the politics.
Yeah, that is an advantage in a way.
It's also the disadvantage because I didn't know where to go and who to try to help me. And it was difficult. And nothing to do with Anglo Jewry, nothing to do with Jews in this country. But I think English, some people might take offense, but it's not meant. But, you know, English English manner is very much to start off with no. Right? And there's a lot of, you know, Americans always start off with yes. Most of it they can't necessarily always achieve. So I like to think that people meet in the middle somewhere. You know, English starts off with no and you have to push them a little bit. Americans start off with yes and you have to temper them back a little bit. But so I think starting off, a lot of people said no. A lot of people said why. You know, there are many organizations. Of course, there weren't many organizations. There are a couple of organizations that are very good at what they do and they go. And, you know, I'm talking obviously to Poland and on Holocaust journeys. You know, and there are some great educators at other organizations. But I really wanted to be much more across the entire community. And I really wanted to find a way that people went together. And I think initially people were very hesitant. Some a little bit territorial, but mostly just hesitant or cynical. And I think it took a little bit of persuasion, a little bit of just constant badgering and some expletives along the way and some frustrations along the way. But yes. I mean, you've been to Poland with me, Laura, so you know you understand.
Yeah, I learned loads.
But the truth is that I think I just believe very strongly, and I took some good people along with me who helped spread the message. And I had 1 or 2 funders and 1 or 2 organizations that really bought in early on as to what we were trying to do and what I wanted to try and achieve. And that was to give an education, and not only about the Holocaust, but about 1,000 years of Jewish history, about life.
Right. That's also different in your vision. It's not about death camps. It's about life, Jewish life, and then understanding the death camps and the mass murder in that context.
I've always said, Laura, that you can't understand what was lost until you understand what was there before. I know that people have used that and at other places, but I really believe that that's very important. And I also have very much a strong belief, and again, you've seen this, a strong belief that the story doesn't end in 1945, that there is an ongoing story, and there's Jewish life today, and we can argue the style of it and we can argue the depths of it, but there is people who live there who are Jewish, and some who want to be Jewish and are searching for their own identity. We make those connections, and that's really important.
Yeah.
And beyond that, the story is not just a Jewish story. It starts as a Jewish story, but it's not just it's a human story. It's about people. It's about all people. And one of the great achievements I think that we have done over the last couple of years is take interfaith groups. And I think that has been a tremendously eye-opening experience, not just for them, but for the Jewish participants that go who understand that these people, that there's a human aspect to the bigger story. And if we are to make ourselves much more humanist, if you like, for want of a better expression in the future, it's about respect for all people and for all of us. And it starts within the Jewish community. It's intra, but it's inter as well.
That's that vision is your curriculum. It's what you do. 100%. So lastly, we are coming up, this year's the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. We were meant to be there next week. Yeah. And although in fact when people are seeing this, it's not today. March was meant to be.
We would have been. The march would have been today, and we would have been in Bergen-Belsen tomorrow.
Yeah. So one of the things, of course, is the changing nature of Holocaust education, and you see it in the other wonderful Holocaust spaces, Holocaust Education Trust, Holocaust Memorial Day, and so on, where they're also having to grapple with the changing nature because also our survivors are dying. And one of the things that's so strong, it's not just you want a survivor to come and speak. They are amazing. They come on the bus, and even though you look after them beautifully, it's quite a physical challenge, I think, coming with and so on. They are amazing. So as we come to this change over the next 10 years, what do you see for the future for March of the Living UK?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we all try to grapple with how we're going to deal with this. It's one of those things we don't like to talk about too openly. We don't like to upset people and the rest of it. But we are all grappling with this concept of what we will do. The one thing I will say is, however we do it, and whether it's virtually, whether it's recording, there's lots of different discussions. One thing I will say is that when there are no survivors to tell the stories directly, the story becomes more important. The education becomes much more important, because the opportunity for Holocaust denial, for nobody to counter back and say, I was there, increases. And so the work of March of the Living, and not just March of the Living, other Holocaust journeys that take place and other Holocaust education programs that take place. And you've mentioned a couple that are really excellent, and the museum in Nottingham and places like are doing amazing work. And I think I think absolutely the role of March of the Living and what we do to make sure that people keep going, that people not only are able to listen to the testimony, even if it's at second-hand base, but standing in that barrack in Auschwitz, standing in the ghetto in Warsaw or in Łódź, and hearing those stories and seeing for themselves that these places are real becomes more important. Because honestly, the one thing we can't do is have it just put at the back of a history book and forgotten about.
That's true. We cannot have it put at the back of a history book and forgotten about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your work and inspiration. We truly value you, and you have changed hundreds and hundreds of people's lives, and certainly the face of Anglo Jewry. Thank you.
Laura, thank you very much. I'm truly honoured, and I shall carry on doing what I do for as long as I can.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Bye.